welcome to the final session of today's, the final session today. And before we start, there are certain announcements I want to make. Piotr has already told us yesterday that that we are actually short of one speaker, because in your program you have 4 speakers, but Marta Kyle, unfortunately, she could not come. So our session will be the same as all other sessions, which means that we'll include just 3 speakers. And then theoretically, we could end the session by 7:30 rather than 8:15. However, bearing in mind that the last session is always the opportunity to raise the issues and in reference to the papers which have been given earlier during this day and even earlier during the conference, so please use the opportunity of actually doing that. So the session is focused on the issues of curation, and we will have the 3 types of approaches to the issues of curating the East. And but I'm not going to say anything in advance because I might have misunderstood the abstract. So we will have a paper by Joanna Sokołowska, and then we'll have a paper by Esther Sokacz, and then we'll end up with the paper by Krzysztof Nagy. And the first speaker is Joanna Sokołowska. So Joanna is a curator at the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, and so her paper probably will be about the aspects of about the practical aspects of curating, which are somehow filtered through the notion of the critical curation. Her work has focused on a variety of issues with a strong kind of social art history or social aspect on the intersections and frictions between art, economy and politics against the backdrop of the current transformations in labor conditions. Joanna is also interested in the notion of center and periphery and in the artistic practice of translation. And she has curated a number of exhibitions, many of them in the place in which she works, at the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, including an exhibition of Hussein, Bari Alptekin, I probably mispronounced that, Facts, Incidents, Accidents, Circumstances, Eyes Looking for a Head to Inhabit, and something which sounds very interesting, exciting, Workers Leaving the Workplace. And she also Joanna curated exhibitions at other museums or galleries such as Accretions at Galeria in Ljubljana, and the exhibition Another City, Another Life, shown at the Zachęta in Warsaw. So, and the topic of Joanna's paper is Undoing the East towards the global semi-periphery.
Thank you very much. In my presentation, I would like to advocate undoing the remnants of the cultural and geopolitical paradigm of Eastern Europe by situating it within a dynamic map of modern world system and capitalist world economy. I will try to explain this claim, drawing upon selected curatorial and artistic case studies connected to my work and the work of my colleagues at the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. The case studies I will try to group in and maybe describe them according to two models, where these are of course working models, because these projects they refer to our practice since the last 5 years only. One would be taking up the legacy of historical materialism, and whereas the other one will be more speculative, fictional, interventionist. Taking Immanuel Wallerstein into consideration might temporarily, as I hope, undo the binary essentialist constructions of the East and the West, or at least help us to situate the cultural, historical narratives on Eastern and Central European region as embedded in complex and shifting relations of power and economy. But most importantly, I believe that this operation could temporarily allow us to question conservative notions of civilizational superiority, inferiority, or civilizational clashes, which are always at work in this, not always, but are very often employed in this framework. Contrary to the legacy of dissident writers, historians, intellectuals such as Havel, Miłosz, Kundera, who constructed the concept of Eastern and Central Europe from the standpoint of culture, civilization, identity, the map of Wallerstein is based simply on relations of production, not on culture. And I would like to claim that perhaps in this particular moment, this stance might be more productive for working with contemporary art than that based on culture. Depending on relations on production, most of the countries forming contemporary Eastern Europe, like Poland, could be described as semi-peripheral, which can of course change over the course of the next years. According to this model, in the world economy or world system, the most important is the dichotomy of capital and labor, and the endless accumulation of capital by competing agents, historically including but not limited to nation states. So there is this fundamental question of division of labor between the core and the periphery. While the core has a high level of technological development and manufactures complex products, the role of periphery is to supply raw materials, agricultural products, cheap labor, services for the expanding agents of the core. But the most important, perhaps for our inquiry, is the fact that the economic exchange between the core and periphery takes place on unequal terms. The periphery is forced to sell its products and services at low prices, whereas the core's products are sold at comparatively high prices. The stature of core and periphery are not exclusive and fixed geographically. This is also very important for our investigation of Eastern Europe. Instead, they are also relative to each other. And now, as to the semi-periphery, it's the zone which acts as periphery to the core and as a core to periphery, and mediates between the two. Semi-periphery countries have organizational characteristics of both core countries and periphery countries, and are often geographically located between the two zones. Also, their citizens have relatively diverse economic opportunities, but also there are extreme gaps between the rich and the poor. One of the effects of expansion and consolidation of the world system is, according to Wallerstein, the increasing global commodification of natural resources, land, labor, and human relationships, actually all forms of life, and creation of extreme disparities and inequalities worldwide, enforced under disguise of diverse ideologies of development and modernization. For capitalism, it means not only appropriation of surplus value by owner from laborer, but also appropriation of surplus of the whole world economy by core areas. As Wallerstein and so many contemporary thinkers nowadays argue that the modern world system is in a structural crisis and is unable to survive, and we are in an urgent need to create alternatives, new vocabulary, imaginations, and representations. Neglecting the legacy of Marxism, many of the prominent intellectuals in Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s celebrated capitalist free market, equating it with universal freedom and democracy. Central and Eastern Europe itself became an imaginary cultural construction based on solidarity of spiritual values without any economic contradictions. One of the striking examples, of course, the tragedy of Central Europe by Kundera, which we mentioned a few days, I think on the first day of our conference. Drawing upon the concepts of civilization, culture, and identity, he reproduces binary oppositions between the West and the East, claiming that Central Europe belongs, in fact, to the superior and universal Western civilization and is only temporarily occupied by the barbaric Soviet Empire, who starts to take the function of the culturally inferior other. In his narrative, Central Europe constituted a kidnapped West, abducted by the alien Byzantine Bolshevik civilization. But most importantly, I think that such essentialist framing does not contribute at all to debates about the future and alternatives to capitalist world economy, reducing culture to conservative and fixed politics of representation. While Wallerstein himself seems not to be interested in art at all, and disregards culture, reducing it to official ideologies of the ruling classes, or calls it also an ideological battlefield, it is precisely here where I would like to open up the discussion and refer to different resources. Well, I don't, of course, claim that artistic production is free of contradictions, but it's not like the scope of my paper today. I would like to instead to analyze the strategies employed by contemporary art to undertake, on one hand, specific cognitive mapping of current conditions of production within the world economy, following the legacy of historical materialism, and on the other hand, to examine potential interventions, speculations, which can modify our communities of sense in a way that would dislodge the discursive dominance of capitalist economic activity and reclaim it as a contested space of representation. I'm referring here to the feminist economist geographers Graham and Gibson, who advocate the necessity of repoliticization of economy by challenging and queering the representation of capitalism as the necessarily and naturally dominant form or identity of world economy and hegemonic global division of labor, which also is, of course, responsible for creating symmetrical divisions into core, periphery, or semi-periphery. And the case studies I would like to discuss, they stem from my own position and my situated knowledge, which is that of the curator in the semi-peripheric Poland, but also in a peripheric, or using even different terminology, third world city of Łódź, at the Muzeum Sztuki, which is based on universalizing claims and ideologies of avant-garde, modern and global contemporary art. So I will briefly try to explicate the first model of cognitive mapping of capitalist world economy, which follows the legacy of historical materialism. This is the legacy of critical practice of countering processes of abstracting, obscuring relations between humans and objects, alienating commodities from their producers and images from their mode of production. And over the recent year in the museum, we made a series of projects that were trying to tackle this problem from different angles, including, for instance, Madame B, explorations in emotional capitalism inspired by Madame Bovary, of Gustave Flaubert, projects by Mika Ball and Michelle Williams-Gamaker, and two projects, Labor in a Single Shot and Workers Leaving the Workplace, which attempted to grasp connections between concrete material location and processes of work with visibility or marginalization of specific forms of labor in global economies, including but not limited those located in Eastern Europe. The first one, Labor in a Single Shot, was initiated by Harun Farooqi and Antje Eyman, and it aimed at tracking, recording, archiving, and possibly intervening in globally circulating representation of labor. The two artists cooperated with students of film schools and art academies of diverse core, peripheric, semi-peripheric cities in Bangalore, Berlin, Buenos Aires, Cairo, Moscow, Rio de Janeiro, Tel Aviv, Lisboa, Hanoi, Boston, and in which where they cooperated with the film school and the art museum. In each place they conducted film workshops asking the students to capture the precise moment of exiting workplace or finishing the process of work, which of course referred to workers leaving the factory by the Mir brothers and Faroki practice too. And they set actually very anachronic formal criteria for the participant. One shot could last maximum 2 minutes and should not be edited. Resigning from the editing, the authors, the young students, had to grasp the specifics of the process of the kind of labor they chose in the very right moment. It was thus an exercise in attentiveness and precision in capturing material conditions of work. And while many students, I have to admit, reproduced simply dominant representations of labor, focusing on like very well recognized forms like wage labor, market exchange. There also appeared footage which could expand possibly our notions of production, focus on marginalized, diverse, also non-capitalist, non-monetary forms of work and economy. I don't think that I have time to show the examples, but there is a website which shows all films produced within this project. And as I said, this archive is available online, and it offers the possibility to compare diverse local scales and places of production and their modes of representation, which is also very important, and diverse dependencies and asymmetries which go beyond regional national boundaries. What's interesting that in Łódź, most of the footage depicted simple repetitive work processes in industry and service, countering the official image of the city promoted by local authorities depicting Łódź as a creative city. Each exhibition within the Labor in a Single Shot project was accompanied by pictograms designed by Alice Kreischer and Andreas Ziegman. Based on statistical data, the artist prepared a graphic diagram and economic structure of a given city. In each venue, the pictograms were combined together so that viewers could establish themselves relations between the different places. The pictogram design by the artist for Łódź appropriated the logotype of the special economic zone, which is the source of pride for the local authorities, but also for business and political elites in Poland. Together with statistic data and images of the infographic, it created a gloomy, oppressive image of the peripheric city completely dependent on unequal relations of extraction of surplus produced locally by the core areas. It represents Łódź as a source of exploitation of cheap labor by international capital with the help of public aid, a place of industrial production of commodities based on patents and licenses created in core areas. The Łódź edition of Labor in a Single Shot referred thus to the processes which are known but neglected under disguise of creative cognitive capital and which conceals dire material conditions of production in peripheric dependencies of the city. If we follow the trail of the special economic zone of Łódź, it will take us, of course, to maybe some places in Eastern Europe, to Belarus, Ukraine, but also to remote places in the world, Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Zambia, and other peripheric economies where such zones exist for the benefit of the core areas. The tension between the discourse of immaterial labor and invisible, very often material and physical one, symmetries between peripheries, core areas, was also involved in the exhibition, publication, and a series of workshops. Workers leaving the workplace. Roughly speaking, it was an attempt to deal with diverse post-Fordist mode of production, and I focused in particular on the economic transformation of Eastern Europe, but I tried to put works in constellation which will resonate with global economic processes. For instance, these are strike objects by Jean-Luc Moulin, which document the default subversive objects of altered production made by striking French factory workers. And this is also a testimony to the lost struggle, class struggle due to relocation of production to France from places like Poland, China. And they were confronted by pieces referring to production taking place, for example, in Turkey. This is a piece by Ali Kazma, or Romania, or Poland, as I said. This is the work by Mona Vatamano and Florin Tudor, and those who know their practice probably know that it consists of extremely attentive observation, recording, and recreating, recontextualization of the pieces of matter. Sometimes they focus on rather on molecular variation, flows of matter. They work with that what is marginary, transitory, ephemeral, such as dust, rust, fluff, and soil. This is the installation, The Path and Rust, in which historical processes of accumulation, extraction of capital, but also loss and destruction, were mediated through the constellation and arrangements of metal scraps and rust in different stages of aggregation. This path leads to rust inknot. It's the same metal. It consists of these metal scraps that were taken from the scrap heap image, and in the end they are compressed, so they look like bars, like metal bars. Finally, I would like to describe briefly the second strategy that I mentioned. Of course, they both overlap. Is the strategy of artistic and curatorial speculation of constructing fictional narratives or other interventions into existing communities and common sense. While negotiating diverse economies, these works speculate about transnational geopolitics that could counter asymmetries between the core areas and peripheries. The notion of diverse economy was coined by Graham Gibson, which I mentioned, who advocate producing a language and images representing the variety of transactions, forms of labor, class relations, types of enterprise, including ecological ones, and development dynamics in contemporary economies, which also include non-capitalist forms of production. These are diverse, often marginalized, exploited, or outlawed strategies, which are considered often as a threat to hegemonic discourse, like care labor, gift, barter, cooperatives. Graham Gibson called for collective disidentification with capitalists, queering and decolonizing our imagination. And I would like to mention two projects that attempted translating this agenda from very different angles. One of them is Untimely Stories, which took place in the Muzeum Sztuki and was curated by Jarosław Lubiak, who sits here, and myself. It was a part of transnational collaboration called Europe to the Power of N, which dealt with diverse concepts and ideologies of contemporary Europe. Our exhibition advocated reversal from thinking of Europe in terms of dominant flat economies for the benefit of precisely diverse economies, including economy of gift and hospitality, politics of friendship, work of imagination, ecology, non-human reason. This is the work by the artists that Maya and Truman Fox already mentioned. Maybe not the work, but the artist Tomasz Kosarz and Aniko Lorand, and there is a good reason why it appears again, because maybe these are one of the most interesting artists today on the planetary scale who come from Eastern Europe. This is a piece called Famine Food, in which both artists anticipate that the coming ecological and economic catastrophe will cause the collapse of current modes of mass production, consumption, and political models. Instead of chasing the existing and outmoded modernization, the artists propose the research of anti-systemic ideas for survival, drawing inspiration from peripheric, anachronistic, pre-modern, folk, or counter-cultural and DIY practices and non-capitalist economies. In the Famine Food, they research poverty food, that is inexpensive or readily available foodstuff used to nourish people in times of extreme poverty or starvation, as during war or famine. Since this food is associated with hardship under which it was eaten, it is socially rejected as a food source in times of relative plenty. But according to the artists, recognizing the potential of such food and other autonomous DIY practices might rise one's chances to survive in the crisis of the future. What is quite also important for both artists that in their economy and ecology, it will be rather the figure of the peasant and not of the Marxist industrial worker who will probably become the major subject of the future history to come. Also in this exhibition, following recognition of Dipesh Chakrabarty and his claim for provincializing Europe, we try to propose to think of European ideologies from and for the margins and peripheries, returning Europe to its place as simply one world region amongst many, without the privilege being considered as a template for modernity. Many artists in the exhibition created narratives reversing the traditional geopolitics and colonial trajectories that used to define the directions of influence and knowledge coming from the West and core areas to the rest of the world. They anticipated that the currently peripheral areas might show the future, including both patterns of emancipation but also of exploitation to the rich center. These are the stills from the video installation by Ignacio Mosquito, who performs an African who wants to buy devaluated West Europe and the United States, and performs in a manner of an angry preaching. And finally, I would like to finish with another proposal, which is more specifically linked to the questions of periphery and semi-periphery and undoing the existing categories. It is the exhibition of Hussein Bari Alpetkin, Incidents, Facts, Incidents, Accidents, Circumstances and Situation. In his art, Hussein Bari Alpetkin, who lived between 1957 and 2007, mostly in Istanbul, he took up the issues of globalization, which he perceived through the notions of peripheries, inferiority and marginality. His artistic practice consisted in recording, collecting and transforming the globally circulating popular and collectively created images, dialect, signs and products. He was interested in cheap, mass-produced objects, amateur photography, advertisement, roadside architecture and second-rate design as manifestation of a hybrid and anonymous production of culture. Alptekin also documented inconspicuous everyday life events taking place on the edge of attention. Apart from the artworks of or pieces whom he gave the status of an artwork, the exhibition featured also objects from the Alptekin archive, which he did not consider himself probably as works of art. These are, among others, commercial brochures, postcards, hotel stationery, packs of cigarettes, food and cosmetic containers, label, which he collected during his numerous trips. This miscellany constituted an environment of his life and work, but was also a reservoir of themes and sometimes material basis for production of his artworks. What is quite important, during his travel, Alptekin was actually interested always in the same things, whether it was Tirana or Helsinki. It was simply cheap logos, packages, and second-rate objects. The political event crucial for his work was, of course, the fall of the Cold War order, which resulted in the intensification of the capital flow and proliferation of exchange of objects and circulation of diverse images. However, the signs of the marginality and inferiority which he collected and transformed in his work didn't belong to any particular historically colonized time-space continuum, but it was just a conjunction of overlapping images of peripheries, borderlands of Western modernity, such as the Balkan mythology and cliches of Orientalism. This representation will also refer to low-rank reality, one that is poor, imitative, hybrid, vulgar, secondary, aspiring, filled with meaningless events, excluded from great historical narratives. The exhibition at the museum focused on the means art taking used, such as translation, imitation, multiplication, appropriation, by which he shaped his notion of globality, which we could consider as an alternative to the inequality-producing mechanism of globalization. In particular, he was interested in the popular practices of translation, which enable the formation of a so-called third hybrid space, a field of subversion, camouflage, mimicry, sleeps, abuse. And I would like to maybe finish with, or offer to rethink, to sum up his vision of peripheral universum. So I think that it enables us to see that his perspective enables us to see the universum where the cultural margins, peripheries, and historical contingency, due to their ubiquity, simply cease to be inferior to the civilizational centers. They cease to be the externalized other, because they traverse and deterioralize, orientalize, or balkanize all boundaries. And Arptekin claims that if we are not capable of getting away with identity, with cultural constructions, with the myth of the Balkans or Orient, that perhaps we should Balkanize the Baltic, the Barents Sea, or any other place on the earth, as he's proved in his unfinished project Sea Elephant Travel Agency, which would include Black, Baltic, and the Barents Sea, just very randomly. Thank you.
What is the last work?
This is the image. This is the photography from the series Elite. And this woman was the lover of Arptekin. She was a cleaning lady of Russian origins, of Ukrainian origins, who migrated like many, and she was highly educated, and as many educated people after the, like in the 90s, she migrated to Istanbul and was working there as a cleaning lady. And it's a series of portraits of such heroes of transformation with their insignia, like pointing to their precarity, vulnerable social situation, like bags, plastic bags, and things like this.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for your very interesting paper, raising many issues that we will be discussing later. And now it's time for our second speaker, Esther Sokacz. Esther Sokacz she works at the contemporary art organization Transit.hu in Budapest. And Esther is a curator and a researcher. And she studied art history and American studies in Hungary, I suspect. She curated several projects, including the project of pseudo-race group Labirynt in 2012. But she's not just a curator, but she's also the web editor and the working group member of the ongoing long-term collaborative research project, which is of curatorial dictionary, which is something very interesting. And we've got even an online address because I suspect, it must be online. And Esther is also a lecturer, and she is currently a guest lecturer at the Art Theory and Curatorial Studies department at the Hungarian University of Fine Arts in Budapest, and she teaches practices and discourses of curating in Hungary and Eastern Europe post-1989. So we expect a paper on not just on the practice but also on the theory of curating. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity that I could be here. I'm really honored to be here. And yes, mostly I will talk about curatorial discourse, but also practice, because I will argue these are two things that cannot really be talked. So one cannot be talked about without the other, but I will get into it later on in my paper. So basically, in terms of Eastern Europe and Eastern European art, globalization and contemporary globalization, I will look at contemporary curatorial methodologies and also curatorial discourse as a field of study. What I will actually talk about today is the dissonances that exist between curatorial discourse and curatorial practice. More precisely, I will examine these dissonances, these gaps, also from a geopolitical point of view. I'm going to analyze just only a few concepts. One of them will be public art, and through case studies, that is through a few curatorial projects that were realized in Eastern Europe. And most projects are somehow tied to the 1990s, so I will not, it will not be an overview at all, and it will somehow stay within the premises of the 1990s in a way, but I will get to it also. So, curatorial discourse is actually a peculiar phenomenon, and the curatorial discourse as such did not exist prior to the 1990s. I mean, of course, curating existed beforehand as a practice, the task of exhibition making, but there were no theoretical inquiries around this activity before that. However, in conjunction with the heightened importance and really the emergence of contemporary art curators as we know them today, from the late 80s and the beginning of the 1990s, that people started to look into some kind of an epistemology or some kind of a theory of curating. And all of this inquiry actually necessitated establishing all these curating MA courses around the world. But of course it started with London, the Royal College, and Goldsmiths, and the Bard College in the US, and also the publishing of texts related to curatorial practice. And all this taken together is what actually Paul O'Neill, who is a curator, writer, and educator, refers to as the curatorial term. So in terms, if we're talking about curatorial discourse, it is a very young, I should say, or very young area of studies. And if we take a closer look at it as a discipline, we have to actually recognize that it's not a theoretical academic line of inquiry. And just let me take a little detour here. As Katarzyna also mentioned, I'm working on a project called Curatorial Dictionary, and that's somehow the background of this presentation, but I will not talk about the project itself, but the broader issues which it ties into. And actually we are currently developing a new phase about Eastern Europe, which is not published yet, and we just started working on it. What is actually already published is the first phase, where we try to offer some definitions of some key but hardly clear-cut concepts that are used within global contemporary art and curatorial discourse. And we also translated these definitions into Hungarian. I mean, this translation raises another set of issues which I would not like to address now, because that would be a bridge too far. But what I would like to point out from this is that understanding curatorial discourse through the analysis of concepts actually proved to be a fruitful, critical, and problematizing tool, I should say. What we also, with this working group that I'm working on this project, we also realized somehow that all these concepts that are circulating, or that within this discourse, such as performative curating, or participation, or educational turn, or new institutions created to describe and legitimize what goes on at the level of practice. And to make this a little bit more tangible, how discourse and practice, or curatorial discourse and practice are related, I created a little diagram. So actually there are two ways of reading this diagram. And so one is when we're focusing on the yellow parts here. So what it means that curatorial practice or curatorial discourse is extrapolated from or practice, or that notions come about to describe what goes on the level of practice, is what it means and entails that there are many more practices that can actually be turned into discourse. So I'm just simply meaning by turning into discourse is that, you know, it's just appearing also in writing and also and just being a part of a discursive framework. And I just pinpointed some practices X, Y, Z as a project, for instance, Project X, Project Y, and Project Z, and I put 2X, 2Y, and 2Z because it's somehow a projection. Because when a practice turns into discourse, I mean, it always gets somehow bigger and more important. And the 2 is just really accidental. The coefficient really doesn't matter. It can be 3, 4. The coefficient does not matter, but it will be always bigger in a way. So. And the black triangles there signify, or the black parts signify that the practices which are happening but which are not talked about, or which are not turned into discourse, or to a global discourse, for instance, but I mean they are still happening. And another way of reading this diagram is precisely this oscillation between discourse and practice. And especially nowadays, people tend to locate the meaning or the, I wouldn't say essence, but somehow the workings of curating or the curatorial between these oscillations. So somehow both practice and both concepts that are supposed to describe it are performative, and so that curating is always in this constant state of becoming, or in a deferral, or also maybe in a Derridian sense. So it's just a footnote, but I think it's not only by chance that this field of study is not called theory. So it's not. So we're not talking about curatorial theory, but we say curatorial discourse, and I think is apt as it does generate discourse around the practice of curating, and almost exclusively it is generated by curators, which also means that it's quite self-referential. And just going back to my paper's topic, this first reading of the diagram has also significance in terms of geopolitical point of view. So those practices from which the global discourse is formulated are employed mostly in the centers of the art world and most visibly utilized by curators, artists, writers, and theorists in those very places. And instead of simply presenting a West-East binary in my paper, I would like to rather underpin also the importance of language and vocabulary. And I agree with Stephen Wright, who said that besides the current crises we are living through, there is also a linguistic crisis. You know, there are so many things happening all around the world, and we do not have vocabulary to describe them. And if we look at the example of Eastern Europe and Eastern European art, this linguistic crisis, I think it's quite apparent. And the way I will construct my narrative here today pertains to some of the international vocabulary that actually fails at various points at the level of description when it is applied or introduced in Eastern Europe. So I would like to focus on a project where this gap between discourse and practice, where on those black triangles or spaces where it becomes clear that concepts of contemporary art and curatorial discourse are not monolithic, but should be thought of more as cultural variables or contextual, the least. And the first project I would like to talk about is called Polyphony, which is organized in 1993 by the Soros Center for Contemporary Art. And Christoph, after me, will talk about more of the Soros network and its mechanism, but I would like to refer now briefly to the work that Octavian Eshanu has started in relation to the modus operandi of the Soros Centers for Contemporary Arts, the SCCAs. And Eshanu was actually the director in the 1990s of the SCCA in Moldova. And among others, Eshanu points out that while after 1989 free market and liberal democracy were to be introduced in post-communist countries, the Soros Foundation and the Soros Center for Contemporary Art also carried out a cultural transition project, namely they propagated and implemented, as he calls, the Western paradigm of contemporary art. This meant that the SCCAs encouraged artists to use new artistic mediums, such as video or computers, art historians to write new art histories, and they also endeavored to bring new themes into the public's discourse, such as gender, sexuality, or the issue of minorities. And Polyphony as a project was just an example of the latter, the introduction of these new themes. And the director of the SCC in Budapest was Susan Mészöly, who is half Hungarian and half Australian, and she knew very well what was going on in the art scene in New York at that time. Her work within the SCCA can also be characterized by her strategy of modernization, updating, or synchronization. Mészöly was planning a group exhibition that would feature Hungarian contemporary artists' works that are, as she called, issue-based. By issue-based art, she meant actually what we would now call socially engaged art, that is art that deals with broader socio-political issues. And let me quote her from her forward in the catalog, and it will be a long quote, and because I will try to trace actually her intentions and also the way she was thinking about discourse and practice. So the dramatic descent, so this is Susan Mészöly now. And this is the foreword that she wrote to the catalog, which was actually published 2 years after the project has taken place in 1993. So, the dramatic disintegration of the Soviet bloc led to a tidal wave of new freedoms, the advance of capitalism, the development of new democracies, the rapid growth of corruption and crime, the flood of information products and people between formerly isolated societies. Major social, political, and geographical alterations appeared not only in the fabric of Europe, but in the New World Order. Today, when the time bomb of the local social political world has exploded, why are artists dealing with formalist or mildly conceptual issues? Many curators and artists working in the centers of the international art world expect to find issue-based work in regions affected by a common social and political environment, especially by major events such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the Soviet Empire, the war in Yugoslavia, and the end of apartheid in South Africa. I don't know why it's blue, but anyway, I hope you can still read it. The Whitney Museum of American Art's 1993 biannual exhibition and Creative Times 42nd Street project, both represented in New York City last year, demonstrated the vast development of issue-based work in the US made by American artists. The former, a rigorous museum and exhibition, and the latter, a site-specific street project in the heart of public space, both created a stir in the microcosm of the art world and the macrocosm of the public space. Artists responded immediately to the call, requesting works for a traveling international exhibition titled Theme Age. In 1994, Edward Lucy Smith made his academic contribution to the issue-based movement with the glossy coffee table book, Race, Sex, and Gender in Contemporary Art. The opening lines read, one of the most significant developments in the art world of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s has been the rise to prominence of art made by minority culture. Works by African Americans, feminists, homosexuals, and Latino Hispanics, once considered marginal, have come to transform contemporary art. And the very last one, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's blue. So much of the visual art since the 60s in Hungary, as well as in many other European countries, has dealt with social and political issues. It is obvious that avant-garde or underground work of all disciplines, performing, literary, and visual arts, during the socialist regime dealt with contemporary themes. Issues of contemporary life, practical and metaphysical, are more often present in the work of Hungary's younger artists in their 20s and 30s. They are, however, less overt, less dogmatic in construction than analogous Western work. Quite often, the aesthetic and conceptual principles dominate the artist's work. And end of quote. So in the case of these issue-based artworks that Susan Meister is talking about, or socially engaged project, which emerged in the beginning of the 1990s and mostly in the US, the mediation of social problems happened through art, where art is interpreted as an expanded field of sociology. And in fact, it is an expanded view of contemporary art. Meister attempted with polyphony to somehow divert from formalist conceptual aesthetic works of art and wished, as she put it, to provide contemporary Hungarian artists a forum to express their broader social commentaries, to address socio-political issues more directly in their work. This attempt, however, failed, and it failed quite spectacularly on several levels. First, Meister was planning this exhibition to be shown at the Műcsarnok of the Kunsthalle in Budapest, and actually the SCCA office at that time was operating or was running within the Kunsthalle. But then director of the Kunsthalle, Katalin Keserű, did not agree to present this exhibition as she said that political art is not art, and that the exhibition incited Marxist ideals inappropriate to our new democracy. Therefore, in need of a new space, the project went to the public space. The open call for participation was reformulated, and polyphony took place in November 1993 for 1 month in various places of Budapest with the participation of 31 artists. The other thing that actually happened within this project that the artists that the artworks that were realized were not issue-based artworks in the sense that the curator had envisioned. The artworks did appear in public space, but with the exception of one or two pieces, they were not engaging with the site and the site in its social dimensions. Rather, the artworks appeared as signs or messages within communication and information structure of the city. Several artists hence chose the medium of advertisement and mass communication. And just a few examples. This is Gerber-Paz's work. It's called My Day is Ruined If I Don't Vanquish Three Evils, and which is actually a quote from a Disney cartoon, The Gummy Bears. And this was mounted on the side of a bus that was transporting the commuters. And another example is Anton Lochner's direction signs, and there are two words mounted on the beam of the Elizabeth Bridge in Budapest, and they read these signs is over here and over there. And of course, it can be interpreted within this East and West divide, or Buda and Pest. But again, it was not it was not an issue-based artwork or socially engaged artwork that Susan Mason had envisioned. But as a footnote, I must say that I must point out that it was a huge achievement that that Anton Lochner was actually able to place these signs on the Elizabeth Bridge. Today, with all these bureaucratic issues, or what would it involve to do this, I think it would not be possible in Budapest. So all in all, for the most part, artists were using the public space as a gallery space, and this is exactly encapsulated in the differing subtitles of the project in Hungarian and English. And while the Hungarian subtitle reads or translates rather as social context as medium in contemporary Hungarian art, the English one is social commentary in contemporary Hungarian art. So social context as medium versus social commentary. And interestingly, this gap in translation is also a gap within discourse and practice. And the catalog also contains the transcript of the symposium that was organized at the end of the project in 1993. And it is really an excellent source and document of the early 1990s, where participants were discussing their oppositional understanding of political art. And at one point, everyone was criticized. The curator was criticized for trying to import a tendency from the US, the artists for not being political enough. Nevertheless, the broader issue here was, of course, the conflictual understanding of what is political art. And again, a quote from Susan Mason. Polyphony culminated in natural death with an invited public symposium, the privileged few viewing slides and video documentation of all completed project. After two guest speakers, Kim Labirynt, critic and curator, and András Szántó, sociologist, described various developments on the American scene, a number of panels debated the validity of issue-based issue-based work. The panelists, distinguished Hungarian artists and curators of varying generations, succeeded in kenning the conceptual and philosophical basis of the manifestation. The curator was accused of Americanizing the Hungarian art world. Interesting, too, was the contrast of opinion expressed by Hungarians living abroad and by visiting foreigners who perceived the manifestation as a collection of works only tangentially, socially, or politically motivated. Miklós Lukas, a sociologist now at Harvard, concluded that polyphony was testing the political nature of Hungarian artists and that Eastern European society is silent. Schukert attributes this silence to the absence of new social movements in Hungary and in the region, which would initiate political and social awareness. So the broader issue, and the quote, and the broader issue here was, of course, the conflictual understanding and different history and context of political art, because in Hungary prior to 1989, political art and just being opposed to the regime translated into an aesthetical question. So there was it's an entirely different tradition of social engagement within the arts in this region, which should have been actually the responsibility of the curator, I believe, to address and deal with. And I will only talk about two more projects, one again in Budapest and one in Bucharest. And the first one I would like to mention, it's called Moscow Square, or Moskva tér in Hungarian, Moscow Square Gravitation. Gravitation was the subtitle. It was organized by the Ludwig Museum of Contemporary Art, and it was curated by Dóra Hegyi. But even though it was organized by the Ludwig Museum, it did not take place there, but it took place at the Moscow Square, which is one of the busiest squares in Budapest. And this project actually can be regarded as a public art project, and the notion of public art is a tricky one, both in English and in Hungarian. The notion in English has expanded from the meaning of sculptures installed in public spaces to basically community art projects, where current social issues are addressed with the engagement of the audience. In this sense, the notion of site has expanded to include its social dimension, and it was, as for instance, demonstrated by Mi-won Kwon. At this point in time, it's quite hard to differentiate between public art, socially engaged art, new genre public art, participatory art, collaborative art, or dialogical aesthetics or art. They are all synonyms of each other. And actually the polyphony project can also be read and has been read as a public art project. However, in that case, I believe the question of social engagement was stronger than the use of public space. So in terms of the Hungarian context, the notion of public art makes sense only in the strictest definition, which is monuments and sculptures in public spaces. That was, of course, bound up with the state's cultural policy before 1989, and is a tradition which still exists and even prospers, I should say, nowadays under the current cultural policy. In Hungarian, in terms of this expanded notion of public art, it is the word public, Thank you. So in terms of, in Hungarian, in terms of this expanded notion of public art, it is the word public, which seems somehow impossible to grasp or translate, as there is no word in Hungarian that could actually truly capture this multifaceted English term, and maybe it's not by chance. And I need to point out that there has been an attempt in Hungarian actually to try to offer a translation instead of just using public art as it is in English. And actually it was provided by Beata Hock in 2005. She proposed to use the phonetic transcription with Hungarian characters, how you would write it in Hungarian after pronunciation, written as one word, so public art. Unfortunately, however, this has not been picked up by others, and leaving us still, I believe, in the conundrum actually how to refer to these very practices in Hungarian. And in terms of the Moscow Square project, the notion of public art, or more specifically new genre public art, was activated. as one can read in the catalog, in order to address the social publicity or publicness of contemporary art. And again, it's the problem with the word, and somehow maybe this publicness it's better captured in German, Öffentlichkeit. And in terms of importing international discourses and practices to Hungary, Moscow Square was more reflective than polyphony. There was also an interdisciplinary seminar in preparation for the project entitled Public Space and Representation, with 20 invited participants, and it featured also artists from abroad, not only Hungarian artists. And the artworks, as it was also pointed out by Beata Hope, were concerned mainly with confronting the public, a search for a broader audience who are not gallery goers. Thus, with the exception of few pieces, they refrained for a more direct activation of the audience as participants. This is also highlighted by the fact that in the catalog, the project is referred to as an exhibition, which rather presupposed viewers and not. And
I'm sorry to be so horrible, but you've got 3 more minutes.
Okay. So while the artworks realized within the project did not really address Moscow Square in its specificity, but the artworks were concerned with social issues like homelessness and or the overabundance of advertisement. Okay. Okay, so I will just cut it real short now. So what was, yeah, so in terms of, so this project tried to deal with the new genre public art, but it was basically activated in order to somehow confront the people with art, to find public or this publicity, which is not really the aspect of originally or within the discourse of new genre public art. Yeah, I just brought a few more examples, and yeah, just let me skip quickly to public art book. Well, no, before just really one more thing, that it was János Sugár, and I just wanted to speak about one of this project, but maybe just in terms, I would not mention specifically this project, but what I would like to mention is that in terms of this aspect of public art, of establishing a contact with the audience, he actually proposed, and as I know from my colleagues, that he proposed the notion of service as a base that could become the service as a base that can become a so-called local variant of public art. And just really quickly, in terms of the public art Bucharest, it was curated by Marius Babias and Samida Hench in 2007, and it was actually initiated by the Goethe Institute in Bucharest and the Armenian Culture Institute and Allianz Kultur Stiftung. And Marius Babias is actually a curator originally from Romania, but he has been working in Germany for quite some time now. And the reason why they turned to public art was to encourage participants to gain or regain their agency over the public sphere, and through that with socio-political issues. They also consider the status of the public space in Bucharest, also in relation to its heritage prior 1989. And just really, I mean, I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into details with this project, but somehow I will try to recap. What I would have liked to demonstrate was that so introducing concepts and ideas of international curatorial and contemporary art through practice, through realizing the project, should be a process of both decontextualization and recontextualization. For instance, in terms of public art, one needs to understand the cultural and socio-political context it's emerged, but also differentiate it with the local interpretations and relevancy, such as the notions of political art, as in the case of polyphony, the questions pertaining to the publicness and audiences, as in the case of the Moscow Square, and the public sphere in Eastern Europe, as for instance would have been the public art Bucharest. And in terms of contemporary curatorial and art practices, I believe it's the aim of these concepts are not so within the Eastern European focus. So the aim of these concepts are not to dress or robe these practices in them, but precisely on the one hand to articulate the points where this dress does not fit or it needs an extra sleeve. On the other hand, it is also important to construct our own new clothes in light of a global discourse, and of course taking another point of perspective or another point of departures, where when it's the construction of our own linguistic concepts that is related to curatorial discourse, that's another task and another topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. We are going to move on to the final speaker tonight, and this is Krzysztof Nagy. Yes, and yes, Krzysztof Nagy. Krzysztof Nagy is still a student. He's in the process of doing his PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art, actually under the supervision of Clara Welch. So here, so everything is within the family. But he was educated at a variety of institutions, both in Hungary, in Budapest, in Eötvös Loránd University at the College for Advanced Studies in Social Theory, and also in La Sapienza in Rome. He is interested in many issues, such as curatorship, crossing the borders, crossing the museum's borders, and he's also the editor of bibliography, the bibliography editor on critical theories and locality. An article, I understand, which was published in the periodical Ars Hungarica recently in 2013. He produced several research papers for conferences in Hungary, such as museum management, and another one on the influence of the Soros Foundation on the Hungarian art scene at the 1980s. And And he also, his recent publication is How the Soros Foundation Subsidized Art in Hungary, Tendencies in the Second Half of the 1980s, which was published in Fordulakt in 2014. I understand that the Soros Foundation is the topic of Krzysztof's PhD, and it is also the topic of Krzysztof's paper, which is entitled The Emergence of the Soros Foundation in Hungary, Decolonization or Neo-colonization.
Thank you very much. Just a second with my presentation, and thank you for the opportunity that I can be here and I can speak here. Yes, and now it should be fine. Yes. Today, I am going to present my paper on the activities of the Soros Foundation in Hungary at the 80s. The Soros Foundation was a philanthropic organization which had a definitive role in the scholarly and artistic activities in Hungary. Oh, amazing. Oops, sorry. In Hungary. In my study, I am going to present the emergence of the foundation in the country, the development of the framework in which it was functioning, as well as how its work was characterized by neoliberal and post-colonial ideas. Yes, here are the slides. Yeah, excellent. I argue that although it played a catalyzing part in the scholarly life of Hungary during the change of political regime, it promoted also new kinds of political and economic dependencies. George Soros, born in 1930, a Hungarian-born businessman, seized the opportunity that opened in the 80s to extend his philanthropic activity to Hungary. The political climate was getting milder, and the relationship between Hungary and the West was improving in several respects, particularly after 1982, when Hungary joined to the IMF, and this situation created an opportunity for Soros. The political and ideological softening Hungary was still steadily governed by a one-party state, offered an ideal field for Soros' philanthropic aim, the creation of an open society in the Popperian cells. The expansion of the Soros Foundation and its endeavor, the popularization of democracy, mainly was carried out by cultural means during the 80s. The Soros Foundation functioned as a part of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, but basically autonomously since 1984, but the Academy had the right to veto its decisions. The plans for a fine art documentation center were already born at the time of its founding, while charter enabling the establishment was signed by Katalin Nérai, director of the Budapest Műcsarnok Kunsthalle, and George Soros on the 10th April 1985. The documentation center worked as a part of the Budapest Kunsthalle until 1989. Its task was to document the work of about 100 artists selected primarily by the Hungarian members of the advisory board. Rather than taking part in the production of the documentation, the members of the center dealt with the central arrangement and served the interested public, mainly foreigners and students. The records kept by the documentation center consisted of the brief presentation of the artist and their work, a list of exhibitions together with a list of publications written on them, and color slides collated and arranged on the model of Washington National Gallery. They were clearly arranged, simple, and visually oriented, informative even for those who have previously no information of the given artist. The structure was organized to optimally serve a new function in fine art that had previously been unknown in Hungary, the role of curators. Nevertheless, the documentation process was not entirely clear and resolved. Two aspects were basically set against each other: the need for scholarly processing and the creation for a shorter, more clearly arranged, market and curator-friendly documentation. According to the arrangement between the Soros Foundation and the Műcsarnok, the records had to be made in 2 copies, one of them to be taken to the Budapest Kunsthalle, and the other to the data store of the Washington National Gallery Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Arts, KAZLA. The International Advisory Board was set up in order to professionally support the work carried out by the Documentation Center, and it functioned from 1985 to 1988. With the unconcealed aim to progressively strengthen the international relationships of Hungarian art. The agreement eventually registered a board of 10 members, 5 from Hungary and 5 from abroad. Hungarian art historians László Beke, Labirynt Hegyi, Márta Kowalowski, Lajos Németh and Julia Szabó were made members of the board when only Lajos Németh and Márta Kowalowski had leading positions. The constitution of the advisory board conformed to the general mode of operation of the Soros network. Its Hungarian members were chosen from among professionals who didn't occupy top positions, but exerted a definitive intellectual influence on the life of the time. Nevertheless, Hungarian members were not dissident intellectuals driven by the attitudes of anti-politics. Rather, they hold a position comparable to the reform economists of the late socialist period, who were working within the state apparatus and tried primarily reforming the system from within. The foreign members of the board were G. Carter Brown, director of the National Gallery, Washington, Michael Compton, exhibition director of the Tate Gallery, Thomas Messer, director of the Guggenheim Museum. He was the chair of the advisory board, Madame Ledek, art historian from Washington, and Dieter Ronte, director of the Vienna Museum of the 20th Century Art. The Hungarian party requested the presence of Laurent Berecki, director of the National Gallery and official in charge of art history on the Central Committee of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, on the board, and in order to counterbalance this situation, Jean-Christophe Ammann, director of the Kunsthalle Basel, was appointed to be a member too. While the selection of the Hungarian members seems to show a tendency that the most thoroughly informed, definitive art historians were involved, at the appointment of the foreign members, prestige must also have been considered. Apart from Ronte and Ledek, the members had no previous knowledge about Central European art, but all of them had influential positions at the time. The presence of the highly qualified Western members leading renowned institutions must have meant a sort of guarantee in the conflicts with the governmental agencies as well. The introduction of the term cultural hegemony might help us better understand the relationship between the Soros Foundation and the state in the late Kádár era. Hegemony, in this case, signifies a power structure which doesn't exert its influence directly through politics, but it is effective on other social levels as well. This postulates that the possession of political power is necessary, but not sufficient to have control, and the creation of a social, cultural hegemony is also inevitable. In the 1980s, a power struggle developed between the Soros Foundation and the Hungarian state for cultural hegemony. Earlier, it was unimaginable that the representatives of counterculture would be able to step out from their peripheral positions. The struggle for hegemony wasn't, of course, restrained to one field. Similar processes took place in the economy during the 80s and in the politics of the end of the decade as well, but the Soros Foundation was chiefly active in the realms of education and culture. The question remains why the government allowed the Soros Foundation to be established in Hungary when it endeavored to overthrow the hegemonic power of the government. The situation between the aims of the foundation and those of the state was paradoxical. On the one hand, the foundation spent large sums of money on Hungarian culture, while the Hungarian state was beginning to withdraw from this area. Their interests were identical from this point of view, since the culture unfunded by the government was also supported by the foundation. On the other hand, both parties wanted to maintain and develop their own cultural hegemonies. The Soros Foundation wished to reform culture on the basis of the liberal humanitarian utopia, That was a novelty in Hungary, whereas the party state wanted to sustain its own dominant role, even though the ideology behind it was wearing away. In this respect, the interests of the parties were fully contradictory. Between 1984 and 1989, the state and the foundation were balancing in this paradoxical situation through cooperation with each other, since the agreement was never terminated. The need for cultural hegemony didn't only present itself in the form of financial support. The making of records is likewise a project aiming at hegemony, which took over the task that had earlier belonged basically to the government. Documentation can be called a step toward power from two perspectives. Because of the possession of information, and since the selection and organization of information creates a position of control. Besides all of these, the old and the new cultural elites worked together within the circles of the Soros Foundation in the second half of the 80s. As a result of the mutual and enforced cooperation, a subtle and continuous shift was observable in the relations of power. Partly due to this, no radical change took place in the art life of Hungary in 1989, since it had already started in the 80s and it didn't end in 1989. That is why a Velvet Revolution, a soft shift took place where the agents and institutions that had already been present could continue their activities. This war of positions, which was operated by small tools step by step, contributed to the transformation of the sphere of arts parallel with the transformation of the 80s. The assimilation of the new cultural elite into the hegemony, however, had serious dangers in itself. The participants lost their critical political tools which had served for them in their opposition against the institutions and official culture and politics. In this case, the new elite, formed by the Soros Foundation, started to work much more like a traditional than an organic intelligentsia. This distinction was used by Antonio Gramsci, whereas interpreted their position as a function separated from the majority of the society, in which they are exclusively responsible for the transformation of the contemporary art scene. The notion of parallel modernity of the Eastern and Western world started to crumble at the end of the 70s. This idea can be understood as an ideology of modernization that ran parallel and was competing in the Western and in the socialist countries and strongly dominated the thinking after the Second World War. This thinking set its aims in the creation of a world and art as modern as possible, mutually competing with the other bloc. In Eastern Europe, and especially in Hungary, the new situation emerging in the 80s resulted in the rethinking of the relationship between East and West. The freshly formed SUS system endeavored to draw on conclusions from the experiences of the Western capitalist world and integrate them into socialism rather than outdo the Western world. This created a double dependency in the system where both Soviet and Western capitalist expectations had to be met at the same time. A good example of this is the activity of the Documentation Center, which served two masters. It collaborated with the cultural politics of the late Qatar era and catered to the needs of the Soros Foundation as well as that of professionals of art from Western Europe and America. The concept of slope can help us understand this situation. According to Attila Mellett, in the 90s, the change in situation of the countries of the Eastern Bloc replaced the idea of rivaling modern imperial circles in public truth with the notion of West-East slope. The slope is a concept of civilization and economics descending from west toward east. West-dominated civilized countries and nations are on the top of the slope, while towards the lower end, undeveloped barbaric semi-European countries can be found. This slope didn't come to exist at the time. Only the concept of the backward and Eastern Europe, known from the Age of Enlightenment, experienced a revival. Hungary and the Eastern Bloc are not situated at the bottom, but somewhere in the middle of this slope. every member's aim is to get as high as possible on the slope, that is, to become to the most similar to the Western, civilized, capitalist model. The activity of the Soros Foundation focused on moving the Hungarian and the Eastern European countries upward the slope. This means that in its philosophy, the foundation accepted the existence of this civilization slope and the subordinate semi-peripheral position of Hungary in comparison with Western countries. These things took place during a civilization process whose aim was to help Hungarian elite acquire Western behavior. From Madame Adler's point of view, it's dubious how successfully these steps can be, since, according to her description, Hungarian artists are fundamentally different from their Western European counterparts. She said, and now I am quoting, they are not patient, they want success and material advantage now, immediately. They are suddenly confronted with the different possibilities and they are unable to handle them. They are aggressive and confused. Here you can see Madame Ledek with the circle of Hungarian artists in the flat of Julia Klanicai and György Galántai. Her reasoning tallies with how the West, that constructed the East as its own counterpoint, described it as the factor that has always existed and is determined historically as well as biologically. A quite similar reasoning can be found in Stephen Mansbach's letters, where he complains about the slowness of compiling the documentation. In this letter, he questioned the logic behind the selection of artists. And now I am quoting again. Although requested, no rationale for the selection of the artists to be documented has been provided, and he explains his opinion. The selection process appears to be the result of a personal choice of few Hungarian art critics. It doesn't necessarily reflect scholarly need or expectation in this country. That is to say, Hungarian art historians were not able to make a conscious decision on scholarly ground. Instead, in his opinion, they only kept their own particular interests in mind. Mansbach even offered a suggestion to minimize the damage caused by Hungarian historians of art working in an unscholarly manner. And I'm quoting again. A working committee might be best composed exclusively of Western scholars and museum officials, thereby ensuring both political independence from Eastern governmental influence and responsiveness of the needs of Western scholars and curators. So in Mansbach reading, the sole aim of the documentation center was to give the best and fastest possible information to Western experts. Mansbach's arguments are also built upon the superiority of the West, narrowing themselves to dialectics. The scholarly method of the West is set in opposition to the irrationality and laziness of the East, Western independence and imperiality to Eastern bias. This discourse clearly demonstrates how Hungarian art and the studies of art were put in the category of underdeveloped and uncivilized, from where they could only remove with the help of the Western experts. The documentation process of the center, when examined as a scholarly methodology, also indicates hierarchical conditions. The documentation was made according to the Western Anglo-American model, since it was considered to be accepted scholarly method. The resolution of this project was given to Hungarian historians of art, but its supervision was done by Harry Milon from the United States. Western researchers or gallery owners had only to look into the files and they could already make their grand statements regarding Eastern art or choose the artwork they deemed acceptable. Thus, the documentary center as a scholarly database served the formation of an asymmetrical scholarly relationship. This asymmetry continued to exist in the 1990s, but then its center was already partly located in Budapest. At the time, the leaders of the Soros centers for contemporary art of other countries traveled to Budapest to learn database handling. and Susan Macy visited them from Budapest in order to define the principles of their operation and documentation. So, the subordination didn't cease to exist, but Budapest was a given intermediary advantaged role in this region. Setting the utopia of a Western level of development as an aim didn't only characterize the Western participants. The Documentation Center functioned as an elite project, which meant the opportunity for the enlightened Western-oriented part of the art life. The supported Hungarians may have felt that the society experienced an increasing need for Europeanness, and the Soros Foundation could assist the fulfillment of this need, that is, to help them become European in Eastern Europe, which around 1989 was a synonym of being undeveloped. In the 80s, Hungarian artists had an uncritical and optimistic view of the West, which even Madame Ladek found exaggerated. She wrote, and I'm quoting against, "For them, the US means success, money, Western style of life, which they admire without knowing and understanding it," she wrote to George Soros. The cultural elite of Hungary was a partner in setting Western models as an ultimate goal, and they mostly shared the idea of conversion to the Western models through modernization, a thought that was also represented by the mainstream transitology of the time. In spite of the above-mentioned processes, in spite of the above-mentioned processes, it is not correct to interpret this relation as an unilateral exploitation of the art scene of the periphery. For a better description of the situation, we can use a more complex concept of networks, which emphasize the bilateralism and continuous evolution of the transnational relationships. Nevertheless, the positions within the network are not compare, and their obligatory points of passage are controlled by specific actors. From these points were controllable the flow of resources within the network. With the help of this model, we could understand more deeply the activity of the Soros Foundation was not a direct colonization, rather than the extension of the network of the contemporary art to Hungary. From the emergence of this network, all the participants had advantages. The Hungarian artists and art historians got a free admission to the international circulation of contemporary art. Moreover, the emergence of their network led them additional financial supports to their project and to the confirmation of their leading position in the local scene. In parallel, the Western actors gained access to the resources for their research, exhibitions, and they had the opportunity to use the local sources as a base material to their publications. Moreover, they could extend their scientific network to a new region, and it strengthened their Eastern European art expert position in the art world. And another goal was the replanting of the Western time orientation in the artist's own practice, and in the whole field of contemporary art as well. That is how Western methods, as curators' exhibition, forms, as public art, and topics emerged in the Hungarian art of the early 90s, and these are the forms that could ensure fitting in with the global art world. The Soros Foundation, similarly to the other spheres of the society, preferred and supported the art based on thin identities, which are less embedded to the society than the art based on thick identities, as class identity or nationalism, which are strongly rooted in the past and are expressing the experience of belonging to a collective. I use the distinction of Zsuzsanna Gille. From this point, we can understand that the art projects supported to the Soros Foundation by that, usually with the topics of regionality, gender, abstracted politics, multiculturalism, and internet. This phenomenon was also named as Soros Realism by Miško Šulakovič. The thought of artistic underdevelopment explains why the fine art profile of the foundation focused on the documentation, so to the discovery of the European Hungarian art at the 80s, and to the intervention, to the development and the creation of the Western type contemporary art tendencies in the 90s. The purpose was to give birth to such an art in Hungary that could demonstrate that Hungarian art belonged to Europe. To conclude, in the 1980s, although it couldn't work entirely autonomously, the Soros Foundation could basically realize its own concept regarding contemporary art. A new methodology and operation system developed where the successful management of contracts and institutions received a progressively more important role. To realize and represent these aims, the foundation created a new cultural elite and a new liberal, West-oriented cultural hegemony which overthrew the artistic dominance of the late Galeria. The change of the hegemony of fine arts represented a small but integrated part of the whole Soros project. Due to the activities of the Soros Foundation, an integration started in the 80s, and as a result, Hungarian contemporary art, or at least its elite, joined to the global art world. This joining didn't result in equal positions, but the Hungarian field of contemporary art got into a subordinate, semi-peripheral position, and its own institution system took shape in accordance with that. Consequently, the super and subordinations within the international world of art continued to exist and reproduce themselves, and the cultural field and its elite did so too. As a result, a new, closely woven mesh of dependencies and power relations has formed, which appeared as a natural phenomenon for the Western-oriented elite of contemporary art until 2010. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for their excellent papers, and I would like to ask you to join to sit at the table and to be prepared for, no doubt, many questions from the audiences. We have a kind of good, large constituency of experts on Hungary and Hungarian curators and research, because the Hungary dominated our session tonight. Well, we discussed all kinds of issues, but the major thing was, in a way, exhibitions as the critical tool, and also, I mean, that, which was pointed out by Joanna and discussed by discussing the series of exhibitions which were based on which kind of refer to the legacy of Marxism. And then my question to you, because I use my opportunity to actually to ask a question as well, would be to what extent actually, because you were showing us those very interesting exhibition and you were discussing them in a very kind of convincing way, but I just would like to know to what extent the audiences got those critical messages. How did the audience react? How did the audiences follow the curatorial idea? That brings us to the issue of the to the gaps between, perhaps not just the gaps, but the complex relationship between curatorial practices and curatorial discourse. And it's actually don't know what's there first. I suppose is it curatorial practice or is it curatorial discourse, or where is actually art practice? Because we only talked about curation, but we didn't talk about art. But since, of course, this magic discourse, what would we do today without the term discourse? I mean, discourses which produce the objects of which they speak. So I suppose that it is curatorial discourse which produce art of which it speaks, or it actually expects a certain kinds of art. So that, of course, brings me to my topic of the super ego. In a way, the curatorial discourse is a kind of super ego, is it? and the superego was for me was was a manifest was a kind of a clear case. I mean, the way in which the Soros Foundation aims to kind of to Western, I mean, wants to give a helping hand to the to Hungarian art scene, and then in a way to aims to dominate it and to mold it according to the expectation of the Western audiences, of the Western critique. That would be another example of this kind of creation of the ego ideal by the superego. So, so there are three issues, but I'm pretty sure that there will be many more questions from the audience. So, all right, Marina, Marina Ruben. I saw the third hand, the lady here, then Clara and Beate. So, and oh my goodness, I forgot the order. Eva and Piotr. Okay, so let's start. So that's enough for a moment, and then we'll have a second round of questions. So we start from Marina.
Thank you. I have a question for Esther. Esther, you showed some example of interventions into the public space, and my question is how important are these special spaces for it? So it was Moscow Square. I learned about the Moscow Square as a non-lieu and about the career of so gentrification or something, or like the Elizabeth Bridge. Why this place were chosen? And another question also about public space: how has been changed the public space now? I mean, the new monuments or some traces of some messages of the regime of the politics.
Okay. So I'd like to congratulate everyone, but my question now is for Joanna, and I think maybe starting with a comment and then a question. So I think it was really useful the way that you situated your discussion of globalization very much in a specific context, and somehow thinking about what kind of globalization are we talking about. So are we talking about a more abstract, ahistorical, trans-historical view of globalization, or a specific one, maybe neoliberal global capital, neoliberal globalization, or which kind of globalization are we talking about? And also the kind of I think the way you reflected on the conditions of globalization right now in Eastern Europe as well. So the way there's a kind of uneven terrain, that you can no longer just see globalization as a model where certain things happen in the centers, maybe the more intellectual creative sides, and then the slave labor happens somewhere else in the world, but where this is distributed, you can't really spatially or geographically pin it down, because things overlap and these processes are happening everywhere. So as you pointed out, thinking about Łódź, my question is about Łódź, really, the kind of paradoxes of Łódź, of as you said, you know, in a way, there's it's a world-class or kind of first world museum in the middle of a city, which you said has a little bit of kind of third world characteristics as well. I mean, it's also, I mean, among the many interesting things about Łódź is it also has, I think, one of the biggest shopping centres in the world, or in Europe, or something like that. So it's also a model of all kinds of transformations of capitalism. So really just really, if you could just ask you to just reflect a little more about the kind of potential that working from Łódź in this particular situation gives you to reflect on the complexities of globalization as it affects Eastern Europe and East European art. Thank you.
We'll do another round, okay?
I would like to thank you to Christoph for very interesting papers on Soros, because it adds actually a lot to my own research on Soros Contemporary Art Centers network in the 90s, which I already finished my PhD lately. And I also would like to ask you if you are going to contextualize because I understood that you are going only to the 80s, and if you're going to contextualize it with other activities, for example, Fatih Neray and her exhibitions, because she tries to export the Hungarian art to the Western countries and other Eastern countries, and to show the Hungarian art as modern and a bit universal. So it's her policy, and Cole was a bit as a Soros. So I'm really interested if you are going to take into account of these activities.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on that as well. A question for Christoph, if you could say a little bit about the withdrawal of funding and what happened at the end, and how did that work financially, and what was the impact for power and for your kind of wider argument about the end of that process, because you talked very compellingly about the transformations of the beginning, but presumably the end is also part of the story.
Yes, thank you. So I would also pose questions to Christoph's talk, because the way I understand your talk is that now it complements a discourse or whatever, like investigations that are emerging in the last couple of years, or maybe some of them earlier, and I think it was in the field of economic history or economics that it was pointed out, kind of like a very similar way that what you were illustrating with the board members, the Western and the Hungarian, within the field of economy, really an international set of economists try to figure out what route of capitalism Eastern Europe should follow after the system change, and then they finally decided for the shock therapy, so kind of like what Murawska suggested. And then there is also at least one work talking about how the institutionalizations of gender studies also pointed to this direction, kind of like selling the liberal agenda, whereas it was also clearly institutionalized the progressive study field, and then now you supplemented it with the cultural aesthetic field. So this raises the following question. You said that there was a struggle between the Hungarian state and the Western agents bringing in their liberal values and welcomed by the liberal opposition. But as yesterday Eva Forgács pointed out, there was another important protagonist around system change, at least in Hungary they were there, and this is the conservative, centrist, and later increasingly nationalist opposition. So my question is that where were they in this struggle? And can it be the case that they were effectively marginalized in this struggle over the cultural field, and that they are taking center stage now, if not a revenge, in these very years in Hungary? And the second one is more like a remark that while I'm 100% ready to endorse your argumentation, I would find it an equally important aspect of your investigation to explore how local actors negotiated or managed this situation, because you talked about the complying intellectuals, whereby you created an image of a total triumph of the Soros liberal agenda, but I think it was somehow also through the Soros institutions and discourses and persons brought in that a leftist discourse other than the vulgar Marxism came in, so which is something like self-goal, or what's the term?
Thank you. I found course, all three talks very interesting. But I feel compelled to make a few remarks regarding the Hungarian situation. I think that George Soros's activity can hardly be underestimated. So he almost single-handedly did a lot of things that changed the entire picture in Hungary. But while he was very well informed about the oppositional intellectuals, to whom he already throughout the second half of the 1980s offered scholarships and it made it possible that they stay in the United States, especially in New York City, for several months. He had no information about the art life in Hungary. And therefore he brought in Suzy Macer from Australia and Madame Ladek. Now both were, I really feel compelled to make the records clear at this point, both were very fleeting presences in Hungary. Suzy Macer had no idea about the Hungarian art before she set foot in Hungary in '89 or so, or maybe a year earlier. And of course she got the information she needed very soon, but I would not quote her as an authority. And especially I have a problem with this category of issue-based art, which to me it sounds like a rephrasing of the Marxist concept of content as opposed to the form in art. And she disappeared also from the Hungarian scene. And she was not inventing curatorial work, especially because there had been very serious and high-quality curatorial work in Hungary. All those people who were included in the Soros Curatorial Board had been doing very serious curatorial work, as well as all those other people who organized and provided the concepts of various exhibitions and made the selection of the material. The word was not in use. They were called organizers or exhibition arrangers or whatever you want. So the word was really not in use, but curatorial work had existed and very seriously. And so this, I found, of course, your account of the Soros Foundation very important and interesting, as to Christoph. But Madame Ladek I would really forget about. So, I mean, she was really somebody who... No, it's really serious because it sounded funny what you quoted from her, but she had absolutely no idea. And she was Czech and she knew Czech art. And because her husband worked at the World Bank where Soros had met him, somehow he thought that he could trust her and she is going to be, I don't know, somebody competent. She was not. She met, I also met her, so I can actually directly tell that she had absolutely no idea of anything, but she was very freely making opinions like those that you quoted. And she, I think, disappeared from the scene also not very gloriously. So I think that when you are balancing your work on the Soros Foundation, maybe you want to consider that.
First, small remark, and I'm sorry that will be a cynical remark. You know, this is so funny that Hungarians have been speaking about Europeization being at the same time Americanized, right? So, but the question is also very precisely, it deals with money. How much money Soros did invest in first the headquarters, the Budapest Center for Contemporary Art, and second, to the whole network. What kind of figures we are talking about? And the second question is, he went to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which is not exactly the institution dealing with contemporary art. So why he chose National Gallery of Art and not some, institutions? Although, of course, the National Gallery of Art has the modern contemporary art division, but primarily speaking, this is not the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art. Why he did, why he went there and not try to figure some help from the institution much more professionally involved in contemporary modern art. Thank you.
Okay, so perhaps I invite now the speakers to provide some answers to those questions. Perhaps we start from the left and we'll proceed from left to right. Yes, from Joanna.
Well, I will try to answer the first question. It was Marina's questions regarding the audience. Well, it's a difficult question. I have no idea to what extent the audiences are capable of grasping a certain concept behind the exhibition. What I can say is that, well, I maybe didn't mention this, but it's quite, it's like crucial for me that I think that exhibitions should not illustrate anything. I was, of course, trying to verbalize certain concepts, and I didn't hide my ideological agenda behind, which is quite clear. But I do have respect for complexity of the artworks, of multiplicity of possible interpretations, and I think this is the most valuable, actually, aspect of exhibitions and the contact between the audience and the artworks. So I'm also trying to facilitate this, rather to facilitate certain maybe trails to be followed, but I'm rather interested in opening up certain possibilities and not imposing my ideas. Maybe I chose quite so-called simple words that could be more or less simply verbalized, but it was just for the sake of this presentation. And I believe that there are multiple ways of approaching these issues, that you don't have to know the terminology to, it's also the work of imagination, of sensuality that is at work in visiting the exhibitions, which I think is very important. And the second question was about Łódź, also a very difficult one. So I have to say that the experience of working in Łódź is formative for also my ideological formation. I cannot simply neglect the context in which art production takes place, because it's in this particular case it's a context of radical poverty, and as Ruben said also, this contradiction of working in a museum that has avant-garde, universalizing claims of global traditions, legacies of international avant-garde, modernity, and now contemporary art. Well, we try to deal with Łódź in multiple ways. Like there are projects. There was a project run by my colleagues called Urban Ecologies, which Alexandra Jach and Katarzyna Swoboda, which dealt more explicitly with the location of the city. Recently, we also made so-called ecological projects, which includes, and this would be more easier, but we are trying to, this would be like the ideal balance, to combine the global or world economy scales with very local ones. Recently we are doing a project in which we focus on the biodiversity, focusing on the apple as a case study and the reduction of biodiversity, of genetic resources. And its project includes case studies in Kazakhstan, in Germany, France, Poland, but also is located in Łódź. We planted, with the help of the local activists, all varieties of apple trees in Łódź. So these are diverse ways of approaching this context.
Thank you very much. It's Esther.
Just maybe it was more a rhetorical question, but just in terms of what was your question, what was first, it's curatorial practice or curatorial discourse, but it's definitely, I think it was practice. I believe that was that came first, because as I mentioned, this curatorial discourse that I was referring to, it did not exist as such. It so to say had to be, or it was created to deal with the. And so it was basically this emergence of in the 1990s. But anyway, so I think it's discourse as I was using it today. This curatorial discourse was, I think, the second.
Is the effect of the curatorial.
I'm sorry.
The discourses are effects of curatorial practices.
Yeah.
To say, but where is the out practice? Is it an outcome? Is it first, or is it a kind of third element in this chain? That art would be an outcome of curatorial practices.
Yeah.
Sorry, don't worry. I mean, you don't need to answer it if that is completely.
Just I will get back to it, but I mean one clear danger of this curatorial discourse that it is so self-referential that it can actually forget about art, and there can be curatorial projects with curators about curating. But I will get back to it. So in terms of the Moscow Square, Marina's question, of course, it was chosen as the location of the project because yes, there is a gentrification, or there was a gentrification process around it, but not within the square. So there's a big shopping mall near it, and it is also an interesting end of Buddha, because it's Pest is composed of Buddha and Pest, and Buddha is the more residential area, and this is basically where basically the last stop of all those commuters who would come to Buddha and then would leave to their residence. So this is the last sort of junction point. And also because it's the meeting place of, again, it's very diverse groups, so it's the residents or who live in Buddha, but also the homeless, so the rich and poor. Some might be oversimplifying this, but yeah. So, and just going to your second question in terms of public space, how this has changed since then, and what is it currently? And I would say that it has been quite abused and appropriated, and it's basically what we are going through. It's basically a symbolic reinterpretation or a symbolic representation of not just power, but maybe new narratives as well. And for instance, renaming many of the streets was one thing. And for instance, Moscow Square is no longer called Moscow Square today. And for instance, I don't know. So it's somehow it's getting the public space in terms it's getting smaller. But on the other hand, it's also because of the loss of because of the draw of demonstrations nowadays that we have. It's also so it's expanding, but it's basically an oppositional, I think, process. That it's getting smaller or getting reinterpreted, but also in terms of demonstration, it can also, or it's getting also somehow bigger. And Yes, and I would just like to thank Eva Foliage for her comments on this.
Thank you very much. Now,
Thank you very much. The thousands of excellent questions I tried to answer all of them, but yes, I try. On the context and on the activities of Galeria in the contextualization, I think that it would be extremely important to investigate the relationship of the activities, the Soros centers and Soros network in the 90s, and this relations to the whole Manifesta project, but I work mainly on the 80s, and so what I can say that the activities of the Soros Documentation Center, it was strongly connected to the exhibition politics, policy of the Műcsarnok in the 80s. The Műcsarnok was led by Katalin Nérai from the beginning of the 80s, and it has a new, much flexible and much liberal exhibition policy, and this was I think inspiring. On the end of the finance, it's an interesting story because the finance of the Soros Center in Budapest was finished at the end of the 90s. Before it, I know that from an interview that Susan Soros, who was the wife of George Soros, or today she is the former wife, came to Budapest to close the center, and the workers of the center many times convinced her to not close it, and so it was a complicated story because George Soros' goal was to find financial support for the art from the market and not from this philanthropic way. So this was one of his reasons why he finished the supporting of the art scene. And on the question of Bell, I think that the comparison with the economists is extremely useful, and Johanna Bockman and Galeria have an extremely good article on the East-West networks of economists at the late socialism and the formation of the neoliberalism in this network, and I think we can study a lot of things from these attitudes and from this whole network or actor network theories. And the question about the conservatives, it's interesting because when the Soros Foundation started the support at the middle of the 80s, there were some artists who today are labeled as conservatives, and they were supported, but these tendencies didn't continue at the end of the 80s or in the 90s.
Supported by Soros. Supported by Soros.
So they were not supported by Soros at the end of the 80s and in the 90s, but it would be, I think, a really interesting research to examine the conservative part of the Hungarian art scene and its subcultures. I am pretty sure that there are many. And on the reaction of local actors, I think I didn't examine it, but would be really interesting to make interviews with the artists who were in the front line of this support. For example, János Sugár, and to research their attitudes and the new expectation of the Soros Foundation and this. Yes, what is the next? Yes, on the leftist critique of the Soros Foundation, or I think that it's true that these new topics which were introduced or brought by the Soros Foundation were mainly a leftist critique. So gender critique and I don't know much multiculturalism, but these were a type of an export or not so import of these critics, and these were not built from the grassroots. So this, yes, and yes, and I think to the question of Eva forget that the scholarships are extremely important, and that, for example, the Pollock scholarship, which were important at the 80s, and a few Hungarian artists got it, or in a much wider perspective, the Ford grant from which existed since the 60s in Eastern Europe, were important connections between the Hungarian and the international academic life, and these are really interesting topic. And on the role of Madame Ladek, I think that she was really important on the first few years of the Soros Center or Soros Documentation Center. So from 83, 84 until 88, something like that. So she was important, but only in the first years. Yes, and on the money, I have never summed the funds of the Soros Foundation, but I think that because at the first year they supported artists directly, and after they started this whole documentation center, which was a relatively expensive business, because the advisory board had two meetings annually, one in Budapest and one in New York or Washington, so there were high travel costs and all, and from the 90s the budget was mainly focused to the exhibitions. And
but it should be published, you know. This is the public institution. This data should be accessible.
All right. Okay. So there is an answer to the question from the audience, and I'm going to about money.
Actually, I can answer both questions. Why Mucharnak, why Meda, and what the sums. And Meda came to the Mucharnak in the early 80s to do her own research, and she noticed that there's no documentation in Mucharnak, because the Mucharnak didn't do the documentation of their own exhibitions and events. So she suggested the Soros that it is needed to do this kind of department of the documentation. So this was the first idea and how it really started. And that's why the Madame Ladek was so important in this first year, because it was actually her idea, and it's developed to the something bigger, and then to this Center for Contemporary Art. And when it comes to the sums, so in the first year it was $80,000, and most of it.
We're talking about Budapest.
Budapest. Now I'm talking about Budapest. And most of this money were consumed by the travels and some personal salaries, and and to organize. They organized an office in Mucharnak for the department. And in the late 80s and the beginning of 90s, the funds increased to the $300,000, so it's quite a lot. So most of this money were devoted to the exhibitions, but also for the travel expenses for the academics and artists, and to support the artists' travels to travel exchange, to artistic exchange. I think that's mainly the answer.
Now, can you just tell us why?
Thank you very much.
It was called Balaschi Foundation and not Soros. I never understood.
It has different names in every country. In our it's Stefan Batory Foundation.
Batory, yeah.
Yes, in Estonia it's Open Estonian Foundation. So it differs from the country. This I didn't research. So.
But can you estimate, you know, how much money
thank you very much.
at all
Before
he paid?
we restart the...
No, this is, you know, she's answering.
on-
Can you estimate how much money he invested in Eastern Europe in terms of the old institutions? I mean, Batory Foundation, Soros Fund Center, Open Society, whatever. Do you know this or not?
This I don't know. I can only say that, for example, in the Estonia or in the Hungary, the sums which were invested by Soros in the culture were much higher than the funds which were pumped by the local ministeriums of culture. But I don't know the example for the all foundation.
Okay, thank you very much. Money issues are very important, and I will take the next
Extremely
round of
important.
questions in a second. But before that,
But this is
Joanna wanted to say...
No, this is one more question, was to Christoph about why National Gallery of Art and not Museum of Contemporary.
I don't know the real answer, and I have two hypotheses. The first, that someone suggested it, or that George Soros' networks was related to this direction, and maybe Maria Lunei, who died a few years ago, was really important in the Soros American relations. So, but I don't know. Maybe yeah.
Okay.
But maybe also the feeling of the eternity of the National Gallery. It's maybe seemed to be a much more serious institution than the Museum of Contemporary Art. I don't know.
All right, Joanna.
Just wanted to thank you very much, Christoph, for your presentation. I think it's high time to tackle down this economic dependency and analyze them in a broader economic framework, as you did. But there is one thing that I had an impression that when you were maybe wrong, but maybe it's. I would just want to say that I would be cautious in reducing artistic production that was facilitated by Soros as just a mere commission or response to these ideological needs, because the cultural transfers or even economic transfers, they never function in one way. And I think that also we should not underestimate the capacities of diverting, or modifying, or playing with this ideological battleground by those who receive the tools. And the artists receive the tools, the know-how, the cameras. And I think it would be particularly interesting to see how, because the situation with Soros centers in the countries like Hungary, Poland, or Lithuania, which had, of course, each one had different traditions of modern or avant-garde, are different than in places like in Kazakhstan and other places in Central Asia, where we could say that actually Soros contributed to the emergence of the phenomenon of contemporary art. And right now, for example, in Kazakhstan, I just had a recent report of Valeria Ibrayeva, all funds were withdrawn. And it's quite catastrophic for the local communities, because there is no alternative, no new developments, and no possibilities, no alternative resources, because there is just autocratic regime, and which does not support, is not interested in this kind of artistic and cultural production. So I think this situation is extremely complex. It's not like one-way or two-way transfer.
Yes,
I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's really important to emphasize the diversity of the countries where the Soros Foundation was active during the 90s, and the diverse local reactions to its activities. So I think, yes, Hungary is only one case, and then I wouldn't like to over-determinate the impact of the activity. And okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm taking the next round of questions. First is Laszlo, then Maya, and Bojana, and Beata again, and Amy. All right, Laszlo.
Thank you. Concerning the presentation of Marta. Thank you so much, because a perfect initiation to my lecture tomorrow. I'm sorry, Kiel. Mrs. not Marta, Maria. No, she's yeah. So sorry, because I tried to check the program and I didn't. That's on a mistake. So I thank you so much again, because your activity and your exhibition, what you presented, it's for me the post-contemporary condition to make an exhibition. Thank you again. Concerning the two colleagues from Hungarian colleagues, concerning Esther, I think that it would be more effective or more precise if she could speak more about the activity of transit and network of transit in Budapest and so, because instead of sometimes she spoke about the Soros Foundation's activity, and the two are in some manner together, but don't help to clear the difference between the two. And at the end, about the Soros Foundation, I should like to underline that it's a very, very complex and controversial thing. I was working 4 years for Soros in different committees, and I was the real first in Budapest who negotiated with Madame Ladek. We went to Soros together for a negotiation, and we was agreeing with Marta that we propose a non-profit gallery in Budapest. Nothing was in the market in Budapest. And we proposed, and Soros told, why not 5 immediately? And he thought on profit galleries. And then that was no law for foundation, nothing. And then we tried to go in another way. It will be the pattern that each countries there is a foundation. The foundation has a branch for art only, but there was about 5 or 6 different activities in each countries. And what us concerned, it was the documentation was one thing, and I was a little bit upset listening the letter of Mansbach. Well, it was not the story that Mansbach decided what happens in the contemporary art that time in Budapest, but he wanted to get everything to be an expert. He wanted to more and more speedily and to consume all the Hungarian scene. And that was one activity, and the other, you was absolutely right, telling that in rather each countries the Soros Foundation made more money than the governmental support of culture of art. And the exhibition was very, very important. Each country could make one big exhibition in each year, and without any obstacle of money or so, and no censorship at all, absolutely free, and really, as I understood, in 5 different countries, always the best expert of the contemporary art was sitting there, and not that different controls of thought. And also we could speak about the Central European universities in Prague, in Budapest, and I don't know where more, but the Budapest still exists, even that Soros come out. because he told that I fulfilled my job preparing the falling the wall or preparing to the new era. This is another story that what kind of manipulation were in the network even through Mrs. Susie up till Peking and Beijing and so on. And at the end, I would like to add that in the same time, Peter Ludwig, with his network in museums and collection, was working about the same manner than Soros. And also it's true that he was basically a highest level broker, stock exchange and money maker, and everybody remembers what was his activity in London, where he attacked the British pound. It was rather a very risky thing. I also want to tell that very, very controversial and a lot of very good influence and some risky things in the same time. Thank you.
I just wanted to venture a guess about this National Galleria issue. Christoph, you said that it was the documentation was sent to CASVA. Is that what you said? Yeah. I mean, I don't know anything about this, but I assume that because CASVA, the Center for Advanced Study of Visual Arts, it's a like major think tank in the U.S. So it kind of goes along with the, for art history. So it kind of goes along with this idea of documentation and writing history. My question was actually for Esther, though, because you didn't get to talk about the public art in the project in Bucharest, and I was just wondering if you were gonna talk comparatively between the one that happened in Budapest, because you said that it was a failure. You said it failed in a spectacular way or something like that. And the one in Bucharest, if I understand, I mean, after that, there were all these public art projects that came out of it. I mean, Alexandra Piric she was involved in that, and she's still working in that. And then things like with Post-Spectacle and presidential candidate, it seems like that might have spawned this re-interest in public space. So just, if you could talk about that.
My question and comment goes to Christoph. So, for my ears, really it sounded as if you are describing the coming of Soros as if it was a war. And therefore I asked really about the sources, about the methodology, how you worked. You said you quoted some letters of Mansbach, but did you interview the other people? So, this is the first thing. And the second question is about the title. You asked in your title, was it decolonization or neo-colonization? So what is your opinion? You didn't answer that question.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, perhaps we'll take the same way, the same order. We're starting from Joanna to Esther to Christoph. Does it work, the microphone?
All right, okay. Thank you very much. I think simply everyone has the right to write about our local art histories, and everyone needs to curate them. It's of course a utopian task, but I said it rather as a goal. And I would also like to mention that there are also positive aspects of globalization, which we didn't mention in our critical presentations, that enable us to communicate that there is an increasing amount of resources, of archives which are digitalized, which are made available online, which are being translated. So I'm very much welcoming this development, and I think they will enable in future the research for people from all over the world to be engaged in different local art histories and cultures. Of course, now I understand that there is this that there are borders related to language. If somebody makes a scholarly research on a specific area, I think it's required to know the language. But maybe in future, if there will be like maybe all archives will be translated, won't be necessary. I hope so. In English, of course. But this is our bastard English, I hope. This lingua franca.
This is the continental.
Yes. Eastern European or Latino American English or whatever.
I just quickly like to answer the last Rebecca's question in terms of transit and Soros. It is actually the Soros network, or this model, it's actually, we do consider it a transit. I don't know how many of you know, but probably many of you know that the transit network is itself, what's behind it is the Erste Foundation, which is the foundation of Erste Bank. And
Vice versa. The bank belongs to the foundation.
Yeah.
This is the 19th century.
This is very important.
yeah, so it's so the transit network itself, or the concept of the transit was as a project, was actually developed by Katrin Domberg and Maria Hlavajova. They were thinking in terms of autonomous local units that could operate within Eastern Europe. I mean, it's in terms of we are, each local office it's autonomous. So there's besides Budapest, there's an office in Prague, in Bratislava, 3 places in Romania, and of course there's one in Austria. And in terms of just in comparison with Soros, and as what Joanna mentioned, it's the production of contemporary art, but in terms of transit, what we have to consider is the production of Eastern European art. It's not just because of the locality, but what each transit is engaging with, and just in terms of funding, I'm sorry, it's. I don't know. Can I pass it on to you, and I will just get.
You gather your thoughts, and then you will come back to it.
Thank you for László Beke for the additional information, and I would like to emphasize that you said that the investigation of the Ludwig network is extremely important, and I think this could be really fruitful to work on this. And on the question of Maya, that who should write the history of Eastern European art or create, this is a really difficult question, but I think that doesn't matter who writes it or who will write it, but what is important that the critical attitudes toward the question and an approach which tries to catch the power relations, and not only in the high level or in the economic level what about I was speaking today, but also in the local levels. And on the questions of Bojana, I don't really know too much on the activity of Nero, because I think these exhibitions were not related to the Soros Foundation, but I think that the personal attitudes of George Soros are really interesting, and these are interesting pictures, because he was a big fan, and still a big fan of Karl Popper, but in the 80s when he started this whole network, he was a Hayekian neoliberal, but actually he does a really strange, vulgar critique of globalization. So he's changing, and on the local reactions, I can only emphasize that that yes, we should and I should work in this more deeply than I did in my paper. So yes, I accept that this is a weakness of this paper, and on the methodology, yes, I made researches in archives in different places in Hungary, on the Kunsthalle, on the Open Society Archive, on the archive of the Research Institute of Art History, on Székesfehérvár, and on the Art Pool and on other places, and I made as many interviews as possible with the former agents who are still alive. So I made, I think, 10 interviews or something like that. Yes. And finally, on the question that this is a decolonialization or a neo-colonialization, I think that the activities of the Soros Foundation helped or led to the end of a very direct colonialization. But yes, but this is not only the result of the activities of the Soros Foundation, but there were many other tendencies which led to this. But I think in the end of the 80s or in the 90s, started many new dependencies which are now much more sophisticated than the previous ones, and maybe I don't prefer the word neo-colonialization. Maybe I prefer the word of dependencies, because I think it's maybe much more complex.
Thank you very much. Esther, would you like to return to this issue, or would you like to postpone it to a kind of private conversation over things? All right. Okay, fantastic. And so actually, we could close our discussion now. However, the dinner is not completely ready, so in a way, we still have time, and we could carry on. But I suggest that we will kind of give some rest to our speakers, because they are exhausted by those several rounds of questions, and we want to thank them. However,